The Dutch farming crisis will starve Europe this winter. A manufactured famine. The lights are going out across Europe's breadbasket, and what you're about to discover will shake your understanding of the global food system. Right now, in the Netherlands, thousands of farmers are being forced off land their families have cultivated for generations, and the consequences will reach your dinner table sooner than you think. Subscribe now and drop a comment below telling us if you've noticed food prices skyrocketing in your country, because what's happening in Holland is just the beginning of something far bigger. The Netherlands isn't just another European country with some farms. This small nation, roughly the size of Maryland, is the second largest agricultural exporter in the entire world, beaten only by the United States. Dutch farmers feed over 400 million people across Europe and beyond, producing everything from tomatoes and peppers to dairy products and meat. Their efficiency is legendary, using cutting-edge technology and sustainable practices that have made them the envy of agricultural nations worldwide. But in recent years, the Dutch government has declared war on these very farmers, citing nitrogen emissions and environmental regulations that many experts say are disconnected from scientific reality. The crisis erupted into public view in 2022 when the government announced plans to cut nitrogen emissions by 50% before 2030. This sounds reasonable until you understand what it actually means. To achieve these targets, the government estimates that 30% of livestock farms must close permanently. We're not talking about gradual reduction or modernization. We're talking about the complete shutdown of thousands of family businesses that have operated successfully for centuries. The government has even admitted that some farmers will be forced to sell their land, which will then be repurposed for housing developments or nature reserves. Dutch farmers didn't accept this quietly. Massive protests erupted across the country, with tractors blocking highways and distribution centers. Images of farmers spraying manure on government buildings went viral worldwide. These aren't radical activists or political extremists. These are hardworking families who've dedicated their lives to feeding people. Suddenly being told their way of life is an environmental crime. The protests grew so intense that international media couldn't ignore them, though many outlets downplayed the severity or mischaracterized the farmers as climate change deniers. The nitrogen narrative itself deserves scrutiny because it reveals how environmental policy can be weaponized against food production. Nitrogen compounds are indeed part of agricultural processes, particularly from livestock manure and fertilizer application. However, the Netherlands has some of the most efficient and cleanest farming operations on the planet. Dutch farmers have already reduced emissions significantly over the past decades through innovation and investment. The government's own data shows that agriculture accounts for roughly 46% of nitrogen emissions in the Netherlands, but this figure requires context that politicians rarely provide. Industrial activities, transportation networks, and urban development also contribute substantially to nitrogen levels, yet these sectors face nowhere near the existential threat being leveled at farmers. Environmental scientists, not affiliated with government agencies, have questioned whether the proposed reductions are based on sound ecological science or political convenience. Some researchers point out that nitrogen deposition has actually been declining in the Netherlands for years, and that the crisis narrative doesn't match the measurable environmental data. The targets appear arbitrary, set more by political timelines than by genuine environmental necessity. What makes this situation even more suspicious is the involvement of international organizations and investment groups. The World Economic Forum has been vocal about transforming global food systems, advocating for reduced meat consumption and the adoption of alternative proteins. Several Dutch politicians involved in crafting these nitrogen policies have documented connections to these global networks. Meanwhile, large investment firms have been quietly purchasing agricultural land across Europe, consolidating food production into fewer, larger corporate hands. The pattern is unmistakable when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture across multiple countries. Bill Gates has become the largest private farmland owner in the United States, accumulating over 260,000 acres. Similar consolidation is happening across Europe, with institutional investors buying up land at unprecedented rates.
In Ireland, the government has proposed culling hundreds of thousands of cattle to meet climate targets. In Canada, fertilizer restrictions have sparked confrontations between farmers and regulators. In Sri Lanka, a sudden ban on synthetic fertilizers in 2021 led to agricultural collapse, food shortages, and eventually contributed to the government's overthrow. The Dutch situation isn't isolated. It's part of a coordinated global transformation of who controls food production.
The timing couldn't be worse for Europe's food security. The war in Ukraine has already disrupted grain supplies, with Ukraine being one of the world's top wheat exporters. Energy costs have skyrocketed across Europe due to the Russian gas situation, making food production and transportation vastly more expensive. Fertilizer prices have tripled or quadrupled in many markets because Russia and Belarus were major exporters of these essential inputs. Now, add to this volatile mix the deliberate reduction of Europe's most efficient food production capacity, and you have a recipe for genuine crisis. European Union agricultural data from 2024 shows that food production has already declined in several member states. The Netherlands exported over 94 billion euros worth of agricultural products in 2021, with about 75% of that going to other European countries. If even a fraction of that production disappears as farms close, the impact will ripple through the entire continental food supply. Germany, France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom all depend heavily on Dutch agricultural exports. These aren't luxury items. These are basic necessities like vegetables, dairy, eggs, and meat that form the foundation of European diets. Some defenders of the nitrogen policy argue that technology and innovation will fill the gap. They point to vertical farming, lab-grown meat, and other alternative food production methods as solutions. While these technologies have potential, they're nowhere near ready to replace conventional agriculture at scale. Vertical farms are enormously energy-intensive, requiring vast amounts of electricity for lighting and climate control. In an energy crisis, this makes them economically unviable for staple crops. Lab-grown meat remains prohibitively expensive and has yet to achieve regulatory approval in most markets. These are experimental technologies being promoted as replacements for proven, efficient farming systems. The economic destruction extends far beyond the farmers themselves. The Dutch agricultural sector employs hundreds of thousands of people in related industries, from equipment manufacturers to transportation companies, from veterinary services to food processing plants. When farms close, entire rural communities collapse. Small towns lose their economic foundation, local businesses shut down, and young people flee to cities. The social fabric that has sustained Dutch rural life for generations unravels in a matter of years. This has happened before in other countries that have experienced rapid agricultural decline, and the results are consistently devastating. Meanwhile, food prices continue their relentless climb across Europe. The average European household is spending significantly more on groceries than just 2 years ago, with some estimates suggesting increases of 20 to 30% for basic items. Inflation is officially blamed on energy costs and supply chain disruptions, but reduced food production is an undeniable factor. When supply decreases and demand remains constant, prices must rise. Economics 101. The people hurt most by this are those already struggling. Families living paycheck to paycheck, retirees on fixed incomes, and low-wage workers who spend a higher percentage of their income on food. The Netherlands has a long and proud agricultural history that dates back centuries. The Dutch mastered land reclamation, turning swamps and sea into productive farmland through ingenious water management systems. They pioneered greenhouse technology, allowing year-round production of crops in a northern climate. Dutch dairy products became world-famous for their quality. This wasn't achieved through exploitation or environmental destruction. It was built on innovation, hard work, and respect for the land. Now, after generations of sustainable intensification and environmental improvements, these farmers are being characterized as environmental criminals. What's particularly galling to the farming community is the hypocrisy they see in government policy. Private jets fly politicians to climate conferences where they discuss agricultural emissions. Massive data centers consuming enormous amounts of electricity are welcomed and subsidized. Urban sprawl continues unabated, paving over natural habitats with concrete and asphalt. Yet farmers, who are literally producing life-sustaining food while maintaining green spaces and rural landscapes, are targeted for elimination. The disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality is profound. International observers have noted that the Dutch situation may be a test case for policies that will be rolled out elsewhere. If the government succeeds in forcing through these agricultural restrictions despite massive public opposition, other European nations may follow the template. France has already seen similar farmer protests against environmental regulations. Germany has debated comparable nitrogen restrictions. Spain and Italy are facing their own agricultural policy pressures from European Union directives. The Netherlands is often a policy laboratory for Europe, implementing changes that later spread across the continent. Food sovereignty, the ability of a nation or region to feed itself, is a strategic asset as important as energy independence or military capability. Countries that cannot feed their own populations are vulnerable to pressure from those who control food supplies. History is filled with examples of food being used as a weapon, from medieval sieges to 20th century famines, whether engineered or exploited for political purposes. Europe's increasing dependence on food imports makes it strategically weaker and more susceptible to external pressures. This is not conspiracy theory. This is geopolitical reality acknowledged in defense and security documents. The consolidation of food production into fewer corporate hands also raises, well, some pretty profound questions about democracy and autonomy. When just a handful of companies control seed patents, fertilizer supplies, processing facilities, and distribution networks, they end up wielding enormous power over society. Small farmers really represent decentralization and resilience. They can adapt to local conditions, serve local markets, and maintain traditions and knowledge that have sustained communities through, honestly, countless challenges. Their disappearance means the loss of this diversity and, the concentration of power in institutions that prioritize profit and control over community well-being. Some analysts suggest that the ultimate goal is to make populations more dependent on centralized systems for basic needs. When you can't grow your own food or buy from local farmers, you must rely on supermarket chains and their supply networks. And when those systems are digitalized and integrated with social credit systems or digital currencies, the potential for control becomes, absolute. This might sound dystopian, but versions of these systems already exist in various forms. China's social credit system is, well documented. Digital IDs are being rolled out across Europe. Central bank digital currencies are being tested in multiple countries. The pieces are definitely being put in place. The farmers themselves have been remarkably restrained given the existential threat they face. Protests have been largely peaceful despite enormous provocation. Farmers have tried repeatedly to engage with the political process to present alternatives to offer compromises. They've been met with intransigence and dismissal. Government ministers have refused to meet with farmer representatives or have held token meetings with no intention of changing course. The media has often portrayed the farmers unfavorably, focusing on disruptions caused by protests rather than the legitimate grievances driving them. This is, really, a textbook example of how democratic societies can become unresponsive to their citizens when powerful interests align against them.
Winter is indeed coming, and Europe is woefully unprepared. Energy reserves are uncertain. Food production is declining. International supply chains remain fragile. Geopolitical tensions continue to escalate. The war in Ukraine shows no signs of resolution. Relations with Russia are at historic lows. Climate variability is affecting growing seasons worldwide. Any one of these factors alone would be concerning. Together, they create a genuinely dangerous situation. The forced closure of Dutch farms removes a critical buffer that could help Europe weather these multiple converging crises. Alternative food sources won't materialize quickly enough to prevent shortages if production continues to decline.
Global grain reserves are at relatively low levels historically. Major producing nations like Argentina and Australia have faced their own production challenges due to weather and economic factors. China has been aggressively stockpiling food commodities for several years, reducing available supplies on global markets. The United States, while still a major exporter, is dealing with its own agricultural challenges, including water scarcity in key growing regions, rising input costs, and regulatory pressures. The global food system is far more precarious than most people realize. What can concerned citizens do in the face of these developments? First, understand what's actually happening rather than accepting the official narratives uncritically. Research the facts, follow independent journalists and analysts who are covering agricultural policy, and share information with others. Second, support local farmers and food producers whenever possible. Buy directly from farmers' markets, join community-supported agriculture programs, and prioritize food sources that strengthen rather than weaken local food systems. Third, demand accountability from political representatives. Ask them directly where they stand on agricultural policies and food security. Make it clear that these issues matter to voters. Fourth, build resilience at the personal and community level. Learn basic food preservation techniques. If possible, grow some of your own food, even if it's just herbs and vegetables in containers. Develop relationships with neighbors and local networks that can provide mutual support in times of difficulty. Fifth, recognize that food security is a non-partisan issue that affects everyone regardless of political affiliation. Farmers need allies across the entire political spectrum because everyone eats. The polarization of these issues serves those who benefit from division and weakness. The Dutch farmers are fighting not just for themselves, but for a food system that has sustained humanity for millennia. They represent decentralization against consolidation, community knowledge against corporate control, and proven sustainability against experimental theories. Their struggle is a preview of battles that will be fought across the developed world in the coming years. The outcome in the Netherlands will send a signal about whether democratic societies can resist the transformation of their food systems by unelected technocrats and corporate interests, or whether the consolidation will proceed unchecked. The manufactured famine framing in the title is provocative, but not inaccurate. When governments deliberately reduce food production capacity in the name of environmental goals that may not be scientifically justified, while ignoring alternatives that would achieve environmental improvements without sacrificing food security, the resulting shortages are indeed manufactured. They're the predictable consequence of policy choices, not natural disasters or unavoidable circumstances. Those making these policies are aware of the consequences. They've been warned repeatedly by farmers, agricultural economists, and food security experts. They're proceeding anyway. History will judge whether this transformation of European agriculture was wise or catastrophic. In the meantime, the people affected by these policies face very real and immediate consequences. Farmers losing their livelihoods and land, rural communities collapsing, food prices rising beyond what many families can afford, dependence on international supply chains that may prove unreliable. loss of agricultural knowledge and infrastructure that took generations to build and will be nearly impossible to recreate. These are not abstract policy debates. These are human lives and communities being fundamentally altered. The next few months will be critical. As winter approaches and energy costs spike again, Europeans will face difficult choices about heating and eating. Food prices will likely continue rising as production decreases and demand remains steady or increases. Political pressure may finally force governments to reconsider their agricultural policies, or they may double down and accelerate the transformation. The farmers will continue resisting because they have no alternative. Their entire way of life is at stake. International attention will determine whether this remains a Dutch issue or becomes recognized as the global food security crisis it truly represents. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about developments in this ongoing crisis. Share this video with everyone you know, because this information is being suppressed by mainstream outlets. Comment below with your thoughts and experiences regarding food prices and availability in your area. The more people understand what's actually happening, the harder it becomes for those engineering this transformation to proceed unchecked. Knowledge is power, and in this case, awareness might be what saves Europe's food security from those who claim to be protecting the environment while actually threatening the very foundation of human